The hall was already full when Sarah Cole walked in. Not the good kind of full, not the warm press of bodies that meant celebration, music, the smell of food shared between people who loved each other. This was the full of a held breath. 200 wolves packed into the great hall of the Cole Park territory, and not one of them had been willing to look at her when she walked through the door. She had noticed. She always noticed. Sarah had spent 7 years learning to read a room before the room could read her. 7 years of watching faces for the moment warmth cuddled into something colder. She was very good at it now. It was one of the few things she was good at, according to the man standing at the front of the hall with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw set like a decision already made. Damon Cole was tall. He had always been tall. She used to love that, the way he filled a doorway, the way people stepped back when he entered a space. She had thought it meant safety. She understood now that size and safety have almost nothing to do with each other. She walked down the center aisle because there was no other way to the front, and the crowd parted for her the way water parts for something dropped into it, not out of respect, but out of instinct. Eyes flicked away as she passed. Old Edwin from the northern ridge studied his boots. Clara Mays, who had taught Sarah how to braid her hair when she was 14, turned slightly toward the wall. The altar was set for a claiming ceremony. Red candles. A silver bowl. 2 chairs, side by side, facing the park. Only one of the chairs had a white ribbon on it. Sarah's was bare. She stood at the front of the hall in her mother's dress, cream wool, hand-stitched at the hem with 43 gold threads that her mother had worked in by hand, one for each year of her life before she passed, and she looked at the bare chair and understood, somewhere below thought, below language, that she had made a terrible mistake in coming here today. But she had come. She had dressed. She had walked down the center aisle. She was very good at finishing what she started, even when the ending was already visible from the beginning. Damon did not come to meet her. He was already standing at the speaking platform, the raised stone dais that the park used for announcements, for judgments, for the kind of declarations that the whole territory was meant to witness and remember. He had a microphone in his hand. In the old days, a park leader would have simply raised his voice, but Damon had always preferred technology to tradition when technology meant more people could hear him. He cleared his throat. The hall went so quiet that Sarah could hear the candles breathing. I call this gathering, Damon said, because the park deserves honesty. His voice was even. That was the thing she would remember afterward, not anger, not cruelty, not even awkwardness. Just the flat, reasonable tone of a man explaining something that seemed obvious to him. A claiming ceremony is a sacred act, he continued. It is a promise made before the park and before every wolf who carries our bloodline. It cannot be made lightly. And it cannot, he paused, just briefly, be made out of obligation. Someone coughed near the back. No one else moved. Sarah looked at the hem of her mother's dress. The threads caught the candlelight. 1, 2, 3. She counted them the way she used to count ceiling tiles when things were loud inside her head. Sarah Vane came to this park 7 years ago, Damon said. She was 17. She had no bloodline of note. No park history. No shift on record. He said it the way you recite facts, cleanly, without inflection, as though the words had no weight because weight was something you chose to assign to things and he had simply chosen not to. I took her in. I offered her a place. I gave her time to prove herself worthy of the bond one would be making. 7 years, Sarah thought. She had been given 7 years to prove herself worthy. She had made herself small enough to fit inside his definition of acceptable. She had learned to speak only when spoken to in public. She had learned to agree before she fully understood the question. She had learned to apologize for things she had not done, because the apology came faster than the argument and the argument always cost more than it was worth. 4, 5, 6, 7. She hasn't, Damon said. The 2 words fell into the silence of the hall and stayed there. Her wolf has never fully emerged. Her bloodline contributes nothing to the strength of this park. She carries no skill that another park member does not carry better. He looked at her then, not unkindly, which was the part that undid something small and load-bearing inside her chest. He looked at her the way you look at something you have genuinely assessed and genuinely found to be less than what you needed. I have been honest with myself about this for some time. I should have been honest with her sooner. 14, 15, 16. Sarah Vane is not the mate I can offer this pack. She is not the queen this territory needs. He set the microphone down carefully, as though the conversation were over and the tidying up could begin. The claiming ceremony will not take place today. She is released from her place in this pack. Effective immediately. Released. He said it like a kindness. Like an animal let out of a gate. Sarah lifted her eyes from the hem of her dress. She looked at Clara Mays, who had turned back now and was watching with an expression Sarah could not name, not guilt exactly, but close to it. She looked at old Edwin, who had finally stopped staring at his boots. She looked at the 200 wolves who had stood in this hall and listened and had not once looked surprised. They had known. They had known before she walked in. Some of them had probably known for months. She had been the last to understand. She did not cry. She had cried already, over the years, in private, in the bathroom with the water running so the sound went somewhere. She had nothing left in that direction. What she had instead was a strange, terrible stillness, the kind that comes when something breaks so cleanly that there is nothing left to rattle. Her wolf went quiet inside her. Not sleeping. Not gone. Just gone silent, the way a person goes silent when they have finally stopped arguing with something they cannot change. Sarah looked at Damon one more time. She looked at the bare chair with no ribbon. She looked at the 43 gold threads along the hem of the only thing her mother had ever given her. Then she walked back down the center aisle, the same way she had come in, and she did not stop, and she did not look back, and no one in the hall said a single word. Not one word. She counted her steps as she went. 43 of them from the altar to the door. She did not think that was a coincidence. She did not think it meant anything either. She filed it away with the other things that had no explanation and no use and no place to go. Outside the hall the night was cold and the sky was the particular dark blue that happens just before color drains out of it completely. She stood on the stone steps and breathed the air that had nothing of the park in it and felt, not free, not yet, maybe never, but outside. She was outside. She had the dress. She had the 43 threads. She had 2 good legs and a wolf that had gone quiet but had not left. She started walking. She did not know where she was going. She knew where she was not going, and that was enough, for now, to put one foot in front of the other and keep moving until the lights of the cold territory disappeared behind the tree and there was nothing in front of her but the greywood borderlands and whatever waited inside them. She counted her steps. She always counted her steps. Old habit. Old armor. She would need all of it, before this was done. The greywood did not welcome her. It did not turn her away either. The trees simply closed behind her like they closed behind everything, indifferent, enormous, old in the way that old things stop caring about individual stories because they have outlasted too many of them. She walked until her feet told her she had walked far enough, which took most of the night. The dress was not built for distance. The cream wool picked up mud at the hem and the gold thread snagged twice on low branches and she stopped each time to free them carefully, which she understood was irrational and did anyway. Some things you hold on to not because they are useful but because letting go of them is one step too far in a direction you are not ready to go yet. By the time grey light started leaking through the canopy she had found the borderlands proper, the unclaimed strip of forest and scrubland between park territories where the rules of parks did not apply and the rules of survival applied instead. She had heard stories about the borderlands her whole life. Wolves who were cast out. Wolves who left. Wolves who had done something terrible or had something terrible done to them. The borderlands collected people the way the bottom of a river collects things that have fallen from somewhere higher up. She did not mind that. She had fallen. She was here. It seemed honest. The first living thing she met that was not a tree was a crow sitting on a fence post that had no business being this deep in the grey wood, watching her with one bright eye in a way that felt uncomfortably like judgment. The second living thing was the healer. He was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that had stopped being a description and become a texture, like bark on a tree that has been through enough winters that the bark is no longer about protection but about history. He was carrying a bucket. He stopped when he saw her. "You are not a rogue," he said. He did not say it like a question. "Not yet," Sarah said. He looked her up and down. She was muddy to the knee. She had leaves in her hair that she had not noticed until that moment. Her mother's dress was not going to survive the week. "Come," the old man said. "You look like someone who could use a meal and someone who will not ask questions, in that order." His name was Owen. He had been a healer in 3 different packs over 50 years and had outlasted all of them and had ended up here, in a stone house at the edge of the borderlands, because the borderlands had the highest concentration of people who needed healing and the lowest concentration of people who would tell him how to do his job. He had a garden. He had an archive of plant lore, handwritten in 4 different notebooks, organized by symptom rather than by plant name, which he said was the only system that actually made sense when someone was bleeding in front of you. He put Sarah to work the second morning, before she had finished her coffee, because idle hands in the borderlands were a liability and because, he said without looking up from his notebook, grief that had nowhere to go turned inward and eating itself alive was a bad habit to start. So she worked. She learned which plants stopped bleeding and which ones encouraged it. She learned how to set a bone that had knit wrong and how to ask the right questions to figure out if someone's pain was in their body or somewhere older and harder to reach. She learned the names of everyone who came to the stone house, rogues mostly, a few unmated wolves from the edges of park territories who had drifted this far because drifting was easier than deciding, and she learned their stories in the way you learn the shape of a room you live in, gradually and without announcement. She earned her place. She was good at earning her place. The difference was that Owen never asked her to and never seemed to notice whether she had, which meant she was doing it for herself, which was a distinction she had to sit with for a long time before she understood why it mattered. Her wolf came back in pieces. The first shift happened 3 weeks in, alone in the dark behind the stone house, painful in a way she had not been prepared for, not the physical pain, which was real enough, but the strangeness of something emerging from her that she had not known was still there. She did not fully shift. She got partway and then lost her grip on it and landed back in her own skin on her hands and knees in the mud, breathing hard. She tried again the next night. And the night after that. She never told Owen. He never asked. But sometimes she caught him watching her in the mornings with an expression that said he knew exactly what she had been doing at 2 in the morning behind his house and had decided it was none of his business, which was one of the more respectful things anyone had ever offered her. The 4th month she shifted fully for the first time. She sat in the form of her wolf in the clearing behind the house and felt the grey wood around her, the depth of it, the dark underneath the dark, the 1,000 small sounds that her human ears could not have reached, and something that had been wound tight in her chest for 7 years simply released, quietly, like a cord being cut rather than broken. She was still angry. She would be angry for a long time. But the anger was hers now. Not directed at herself. Not apologizing for existing. Hers, pointed outward, which was the direction anger was supposed to go. Owen found her in the archive 2 weeks later, reading her mother's journal, the one she had discovered wedged between a notebook on wound care and a notebook on fever management, the only personal item in the entire stone house that was not Owen's. She looked up at him. "This was here," she said. Not a question. Not an accusation. "It was left here," he said carefully, "by a woman who passed through the borderlands 17 years ago. She had a newborn daughter with her. She was very specific about what should be done with the journal if her daughter ever came through." Sarah looked at the journal. She looked at Owen. "You knew I would come." "She knew," he said. "She told me to be patient." Sarah opened the journal to the page she had been staring at since she found it. Her mother's handwriting. Small and careful and nothing at all like the woman Sarah had constructed from memory, who had always been large and warm and certain. The writing on the page was uncertain. It had been written by someone who was not sure they were right but was writing it down anyway, because writing things down made them more real than keeping them inside your head. One line. Just one line on that page, surrounded by blank space as though her mother had written it and then stopped because what came after was too much to say or too uncertain to commit to. The king's bloodline recognizes its own. Sarah closed the journal. She went back to the garden. She had a row of carrots that were not going to thin themselves, and the crows had been at the outer edge of the beds again, and there was enough to do in the physical world without pulling at the thread her mother had left hanging. She planted 3 more carrot seedlings. She named them, because Owen had told her once that naming things was how humans asserted ownership over a world that mostly did not belong to them, and she was in the business of claiming things now, small things, one at a time. She named the carrots after the 3 worst years she had spent in the coal park. It seemed right that they should grow into something useful. Word moved through the borderlands the way most things moved through the borderlands, slowly at first, then all at once, carried by the wolves who drifted between the edges of park territories and the grey unclaimed strips of forest in between. The alpha king was riding out. Sarah heard it first from a young rogue named Calvin who came to the stone house with a bad cut on his forearm and worse news in his eyes. He sat at Owen's table while Sarah cleaned the wound and told them what the rogues in the eastern borderlands had been saying for a week, that Aldrich Voss was consolidating. That he had spent 3 years building a network of alliances through the outer territories and had now decided that alliances were not enough and that a unified kingdom required a unified law, and that unified law required a king present in person to enforce it. He was coming from the east. He was taking territory agreements from every park in his path. Parks that agreed quietly received favorable terms. Parks that did not agree quietly received less favorable terms. No one, Calvin said, had yet found out what happened to parks that did not agree at all, because so far no park had been foolish enough to find out. Coal territory is on its route, Calvin said. He watched Sarah's face carefully as he said it. She kept her eyes on the cut. Clean edges, no sign of rot, would close well if he kept it dry for 3 days, which she told him, and he nodded, and she tied off the bandage and handed him a small cloth pouch of dried plantain for the inflammation. Good to know, she said. Calvin looked at Owen. Owen was reading his notebook and did not look up. Damon Cole is already trying to get an audience, Calvin continued. He's sending messengers. Trying to get ahead of it. Apparently the king does not grant audiences to messengers. The king sounds like a sensible person, Owen said, still not looking up. Sarah began cleaning the table. She was very focused on cleaning the table. Is there anything else I can help you with? Calvin took the hint with reasonable grace and left, and Sarah cleaned the table long after it was clean, and Owen continued reading his notebook, and neither of them mentioned the king again that evening. That night she went to the garden in the dark. She did not shift. She just sat in the dirt between the rows and looked at the sky, which was doing the thing skies do at the edge of summer, turning a shade of deep purple-black that was so complete it did not look like absence of light but like the presence of something else entirely. She thought about Damon Cole standing at a speaking platform and explaining her inadequacies to 200 wolves. She thought about his voice, even, reasonable, not angry because anger would have implied she was worth being angry about. She thought about her wolf, which had come back, which had taken nearly 4 months and a lot of mud and late nights but had come back nonetheless. She thought about her mother's handwriting and the one line on the page surrounded by white space. She pulled a weed from between 2 carrot seedlings. She had named the carrots but had not named the weeds, which she understood was a philosophical position of some kind. She went to bed. The next 2 weeks were ordinary. Patients came and went. A woman named Harriet arrived with her young son, who had twisted his ankle badly enough that Sarah suspected a minor fracture and splintered it and told Harriet to keep him off it for 2 weeks. Harriet, who had the look of a woman who had walked a very long distance to get here, sat at the table and drank tea and told Sarah, without being asked, that she had left the Moro Park because the new alpha's mate had decided that unmated females over the age of 22 were a social problem. Harriet was 26. Her son was 4. She had walked 11 days. Where will you go? Sarah asked. Here, Harriet said. If Owen will have me. Owen, from the back room, said that he would have her and her boy and that there was a room at the back that needed clearing out and she was welcome to the work if she wanted it. Sarah looked at the woman across the table and felt something that was not quite kinship but was adjacent to it, the recognition of someone who had also been told they did not fit, who had also packed what they could carry and walked. "It gets better," Sarah said. She meant it the way you mean things that are true but imprecise. It did not get better in every direction at once. But the specific pain of the first weeks, the raw, constant awareness of absence, that did soften. It left scars, but scars were different from open wounds. They held their shape. They could be worked around. Harriet looked at her steadily. "Did someone tell you that?" "No," Sarah said. "I figured it out myself." It took a while. The borderlands filled slightly in the weeks that followed, as word of the king's approach spread. People who had been on the outer edges of packed territories, tolerated but not welcomed, present but not counted, began making their way to the unclaimed strips of forest that lay between territories, which was the only place that did not technically belong to anyone who could decide to close its borders. Owen's house became a kind of informal gathering point. This was not new, it had always been where people went when they needed something, but the nature of the gathering shifted. More people. More uncertainty. More of the particular tension that comes when something large is moving toward you and you do not yet know whether it means to stop or to pass straight through. Sarah met a man named Philip who had been a mediator for the Ash Pack for 12 years and had been quietly asked to leave after he mediated an outcome that the Alpha had not anticipated and had not liked. Philip had a precise, organized mind and a way of explaining pack law that made it feel like something that had internal logic rather than something that had accumulated over generations the way sediment accumulates, mostly by accident, shaped more by what happened to be there than by design. She asked him, one evening, about the king's law. Philip looked at her over his cup of tea with an expression she was getting used to, the slightly narrowed eyes of someone deciding how much to say. "Which part of the king's law?" "The part about rejected mates." He set his cup down. "Why?" "I was rejected," she said simply. "Before the pack. Public ceremony. Formally dismissed." She did not say it with particular heat. It was information. It was the shape of what had happened. Philip was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of very smart people who had learned not to feel silence immediately. "Under the king's law," he said, "a wolf who has been publicly rejected in a claiming ceremony, before witnesses, has specific protections. The rejection must be formally recorded. The dismissed wolf retains the right to challenge the grounds of the dismissal before any neutral arbitrator." He picked up his cup again. "Those protections have rarely been used. Most packs don't acknowledge the king's law as binding. But if the king is actively consolidating territory, the law becomes binding at the moment a pack accepts the king's authority. And if someone has not accepted the king's authority yet, then it's coming anyway," Philip said. "It's only a question of timing." Sarah thought about this for 3 days. She thought about it while she was walking in the garden, and while she was mixing dried herbs into packets for Owen's winter stores, and while she was sitting at the table in the evenings after dinner with the journal open in her hands, rereading the one line on the one page that her mother had thought was important enough to leave behind. She did not know if the line meant what she suspected it meant. She did not know what it would mean for her if it did. She did not know whether the king was the kind of man who took the arrival of obscure information about dormant bloodlines in stride or the kind who found it inconvenient. She knew that the word coming through the borderlands was that the king was fair. Not kind. Wolves made a careful distinction between these two qualities, because kindness could be given without costing you anything and fairness cost you everything and was worth significantly more. He was fair. He heard cases himself. He did not delegate the outcomes of things that mattered to subordinates who might make the decision he wanted rather than the decision that was right. She also knew, because Calvin came back with his healed arm and more news, that Damon Cole had secured a summit meeting. That the king would pass through Cole territory in approximately 3 weeks and would hear pack business at that time. That Damon was, according to Calvin, already preparing remarks. Something in Sarah's chest went cold and clear and specific, the way cold comes on clear nights, not the absence of warmth exactly, but the presence of a different kind of clarity. She went to the garden. She planted 6 more carrot seedlings. She named each of them after a different specific thing she was going to stop apologizing for. Then she went inside and told Owen she might need to leave in a few weeks. She did not tell him why. Owen said that the room would be here if she came back, and that if she did not come back she should at least send word so he knew she was not dead in a ditch somewhere, because he was too old to have people dying in ditches on his conscience. She sewed the 43 threads from her mother's dress into the cuff of her sleeve, one by one, with the smallest needle Owen had. It took the better part of a night. By the time she was done, the sky had the particular quality it had the night she left the coal pack, that deep well dark blue just before Kola gave up. She went to sleep. She had 3 weeks. She intended to use them. She shifted 3 more times before she left, once in rain, once on a night so cold the mud cracked underfoot, once in full daylight because she had started pushing the edges of the things she could do and daylight was an edge she had not pushed yet. The wolf came easily now. Not without thought, not effortlessly, but without the desperate scrambling quality of the early months. It was hers. Fully hers. The months in the coal pack when it had been silent and unreachable now felt like something that had happened to a different version of her, a version who had believed someone else's assessment of what she was worth. She left on a Tuesday morning, which she chose for no particular reason except that Tuesdays had always felt like days when things began rather than days when things ended, and she was in the business of beginnings now. Owen was in the garden when she walked out. He did not turn around. "The threads in your cuff are uneven at the third one," he said. She looked down. He was right. She had been tired at 3 in the morning and the tension had slipped. "I know," she said. "It doesn't matter," he said. "They are still in there. They still count." She thought about hugging him and decided against it because he was the kind of person who expressed care by noticing things and fixing them and telling you what you already knew, and the hug would have embarrassed both of them. "I'll send word," she said. "See that you do," he said. She walked into the borderlands. The morning was grey and cold and smelled like it intended to rain later, which it did, and she walked through the rain without stopping because stopping gave her too much time to think about the things that might go wrong, and she had already thought about those things extensively and had decided that they were real possibilities and that she was going to walk toward them anyway. That seemed to be who she was, underneath everything. She was the kind of person who walked toward things. She reached the outer edge of coal territory by late afternoon of the third day. Not to enter it. She stood at the trailing and looked at the familiar silhouette of the park buildings on the slope above the river and felt less than she expected. A flat, cool assessment. The way you look at a place after you have loved it and grieved it and put the grief down and picked it back up and finally set it somewhere it would not follow you around. She was not here for Damon. She was here because the summit would be held here, on Coal Land, in Coal Hall, and because Philip had confirmed, before she left the borderlands, that the king's law applied from the moment the king entered park territory. And the king was due in 4 days. She found shelter in a small abandoned farmhouse at the edge of the territory, technically coal land, but so far at the margin that it might as well have been neutral. The roof held. The fireplace worked. She had enough food in her pack for a week if she was careful, and she was always careful. She spent the 4 days doing 3 things. She ran the boundary of the coal territory every morning in wolf form, learning the shape of it the way you learn the shape of something you intend to navigate carefully. She spent the afternoons reading her mother's journal from beginning to end for the first time, not just the one line but all of it, every page, her mother's voice surfacing gradually through the careful handwriting. Her mother had been afraid of many things. She had done them anyway. She had been, Sarah realized, reading between the lines of a life written down, the kind of person who walked toward things. And in the evenings she sat by the fire and thought about what she was going to say, and to whom, and in what order. On the 4th evening she heard the king's party arrive in the distance, the sound of many horses, the particular organized noise of a convoy that knew what it was doing. She did not go to look. She went to sleep instead, because she was going to need her mind sharp and her wolf steady, and neither of those things happened when you were tired. The summit was announced for the following morning. She was already dressed and standing in the trailing before the hall doors opened. The Alpha King did not look like the stories. Sarah had spent 4 days in an empty farmhouse with nothing to do in the evenings except reconstruct the stories she had heard about Aldrich Voss, from Calvin, from Philip, from the drift of words that moved through the borderlands over 6 months. She had assembled, from those pieces, an image of a large man who was probably fierce and probably cold and probably the kind of person who filled a room with authority the way a fire fills a room with heat. Aldrich Voss filled the room with something more like gravity. Not the heat of a fire. The pull of something dense and certain. He was seated at the head of Cole Hall's meeting table when the doors opened for the summit, and he was already listening to something one of his advisors was saying, and he was doing it with the focused quality of someone who listened in order to understand rather than in order to decide what to say next. He was not enormous. He was not visually overwhelming. He had dark eyes and dark hair going gray at the sides and hands that were calloused in the specific pattern of someone who had done real physical work for many years and continued to do it. He wore a formal jacket that sat correctly on his shoulders and a ring on his right hand that was the only concession to ceremony she could identify, and that was the thing that struck her most, a king who had not dressed like a performance. Sarah was standing at the back of the hall. She had walked in through the side entrance, which was technically for park staff, because the main entrance had 2 of the king's guards checking the guest list and her name was not on the guest list because she was not technically a guest. She had a right to be here under park law. As a former member of the Cole Park, she retained the right to attend public territory summits for 3 years following her dismissal, a role that Damon almost certainly had not expected her to invoke. She doubted he remembered it existed. She had learned this from Philip. She had done her homework. No one had stopped her at the side entrance. She stood at the back of the hall with her back against the wall and her arms folded and watched the room fill with alphas and their advisors and the various people who attended these events because they hoped to be seen near power and believed proximity was a form of it. Damon arrived 7 minutes after the doors opened, which was calculated, late enough to make an entrance, early enough not to be disrespectful. He had dressed carefully. He had the controlled energy of a man who had prepared remarks and intended to deliver them. His eyes swept the room in the way of someone checking that the room was as expected. They landed on Sarah. The check stopped. His expression moved through 3 things in quick succession: recognition, calculation, and something that in a different man in a different context she might have called unease. On Damon it looked more like the face of someone who had found an error in a plan they had considered complete. He looked away. He moved toward the front of the room. He did not acknowledge her. She had not expected him to. She uncrossed her arms and recrossed them the other way and kept her eyes on the king. Aldrich Voss was still listening to his advisor when it happened. Later, she would not be able to say exactly when his attention shifted. It was not dramatic. It was more like a change in air pressure, the subtle physics of a room altering without visible cause. His advisor was mid-sentence when the king's eyes moved. Not to the door. Not to Damon. To the back of the room. To her. She met his gaze and did not look away because she was done with the habit of looking away. He held it for 3 seconds. 4. His advisor finished the sentence and waited for a response and got none for a moment that was long enough to be noticeable to the people sitting near the head of the table, who looked first at the king and then, following his gaze, at the back of the room. At her. Damon was watching from his seat near the front. She could see his jaw tighten from across the hall. The king's advisor said his name, gently. Aldrich Voss looked back at his advisor. He said something brief and the advisor nodded and made a note. Routine business resumed. The summit began to move through its official points, territorial agreements, border confirmations, the administrative language of power exercising itself in orderly increments. Sarah's wolf was not quiet. For the first time since the night in Cole Hall when it had gone silent, it was very specifically not quiet. It was doing something she did not have a word for, not the pull of attraction, not the instinct of danger, but something older and more particular, a kind of tuning, as though it were adjusting to a frequency it had been trying to locate for a long time. She breathed. She kept her back against the wall. She was here for a purpose and the purpose was not whatever this was. The summit moved toward the item she had come for. Under the king's law, a territory summit could hear individual petitions from any wolf who held legal standing within the territory. She had legal standing. She had prepared a petition. She had written it out 3 times in the farmhouse and revised it until it was precise. She stepped forward when the petitions were called. A murmur moved through the front of the room. She watched Damon go very still. She walked down the center of Cole Hall, the same hall where she had walked 7 months ago in her mother's dress, and this time she did not count threads. She counted steps, but only out of habit. She was not afraid. She had used up a significant portion of what she had available for fear, and what remained was something steadier and harder to move. She stopped 6 feet from the head of the table. "My name is Sarah Vane," she said, and she used her own name, not her mother's, because she was done with the old habit. "I was a member of this pack for 7 years. I was publicly dismissed 7 months ago in a claiming ceremony before this pack's full membership. I am petitioning under the King's Law, Provision 9, Section 4, for a formal review of the grounds of my dismissal." The room was quiet. Aldrich Voss was looking at her with an expression she could not read, not because it was closed, but because it was too full of different things at once, and she did not yet have the vocabulary for what he was feeling. His wolf, she understood from the sudden held-breath quality of the wolves near him, was not quiet either. "You have standing," he said. His voice was even and not loud and carried anyway, the way the voices of people who are accustomed to being heard carry. "Present your petition." Damon stood up. "This is irregular." "Sit down," Aldrich said. He did not raise his voice. Damon sat down. Sarah presented her petition. She had memorized it, so she did not need the paper, which meant she could keep her eyes up and her voice level. She laid out the sequence of events, the 7 years, the claiming ceremony, the grounds given for her dismissal. She was specific. She was not emotional. She used the language Philip had taught her, which was the language of rights and standing rather than the language of hurt, because the language of hurt could be dismissed as personal and the language of rights could not. When she finished, there was a silence. Then Damon said, from his seat, with respect, "Your Majesty, this woman has no grounds. She was dismissed for inability to shift. For low bloodline. For failing to meet the requirements of a mate to a pack alpha." He said it with the same reasonable, even tone he had used in this room 7 months ago. "These are legitimate grounds under traditional pack law." Aldrich looked at Damon. "Pack law," he said, "has been superseded in this territory as of this morning, when you signed the consolidation agreement. Traditional grounds are now reviewed against the King's Law standard." He paused. "Under that standard, public dismissal on the basis of incomplete shift ability is a recognized ground for review if the inability to shift can be attributed to external suppression rather than genuine absence of wolf nature." The room shifted. Advisors exchanged looks. Damon's voice remained steady, but Sarah saw his hands go still on the table. No suppression occurred. Aldrich looked at Sarah. "Your petition references a journal." "Your mother's journal?" "Yes. It references a line about bloodline recognition. Do you know what that line means?" Sarah met his eyes. "I have a theory," she said. "I would rather hear yours." Something changed in his face. Not softening exactly. More like recognition, the expression of someone who has just received information that confirms a suspicion they had been carrying carefully. "The journal line," he said, "refers to a bloodline identification capacity specific to the royal line. It means that a wolf carrying a particular dormant bloodline, a line that predates current pack structures, can only be fully identified by another wolf who carries the matching recognition capacity." He set his hands flat on the table. "It is not a common phenomenon. I have met it once in my life. Today is the second time." The hall was completely silent. Damon stood up. "This is a fabrication," he said, and for the first time the evenness in his voice cracked slightly, not into anger but into something colder and more controlled, the voice of a man who understood that the ground was moving under him. "She has come here with a story designed to." "The bond doesn't lie," said the wolf sitting to the king's right, a gray-haired woman with the title of royal arbiter stitched on the lapel of her jacket. She said it simply, as though she were reading a fact from a document. If the king's wolf identifies a bloodline match, that identification is considered evidence under the king's law. It cannot be fabricated because it does not occur through will. It occurs through the wolf. Damon looked at Sarah. For the first time in 7 years he looked at her the way you look at something you are no longer certain you understand. The expression did not last long. He replaced it with a reasonable, measured look quickly, the way you cover something you did not intend to show. But she had seen it. She stored it. Not as victory. Not as revenge. As information. Ardrick Voss stood up. He stood up without drama, without ceremony, without any of the theatrical gestures that a man in his position could have deployed. He simply stood, and the room arranged itself around that fact because rooms did that when he was in them. He looked at Sarah. Will you accept a formal review of your bloodline under the king's law? It would require a period of documentation. It would require your wolf's cooperation with the royal arbiter's examination. And it would require you to remain in this territory until the review is complete. Cole territory. The place she had walked away from 7 months ago. Sarah looked at the cuff of her sleeve. The 43 threads were there, uneven at the third one because she had been tired and the tension had slipped. They were still in there. They still counted. Yes, she said. Damon said something. She did not hear it. Ardrick's wolf had just done the thing her wolf had been doing, the frequency tuning, the adjustment to something old and specific, but louder. She felt it across the 6 feet of formal space between them like a hand pressed flat against the wall from the other side. She kept her face even. She had not survived 7 years of Damon Cole's Hall by letting what she felt show before she was ready. Ardrick turned to his arbiter and said 3 words she did not catch. The arbiter nodded and began writing. The summit moved forward. She was escorted to a seat, not at the back of the room this time, but midway, with the other petitioners. She sat down. She looked straight ahead. Her wolf was no longer quiet. It had, in the space of one summit in a hall where she had been publicly discarded, found what she had not known it was looking for. She did not know what to do with that. She was not the kind of person who acted on things she did not understand. She was the kind of person who named things, wrote them down, and walked through them in the dark behind somebody's stone house until they made sense. She had some work to do. Across the room, Damon Cole was watching her with an expression she now understood was not calculation. It was the face of someone doing the arithmetic on 7 years and coming up with a number that did not match what he had believed. Let him do the arithmetic. She had already done hers. It had taken 7 months and some more than 43 gold threads and 3 named carrots in a garden in the borderlands, but she had done it. She knew exactly what she was worth. The review took 9 days. Sarah was given quarters in the eastern wing of Cole Hall, not the comfortable rooms reserved for pack members, but a clean, adequately heated space that was also, notably, the farthest point in the building from Damon's personal chambers. She did not know if that placement was deliberate or incidental. She chose to believe it was deliberate because the alternative, which was that she was simply quartered where space happened to be available, gave her nothing to work with. The royal arbiter was a woman named Agnes Cole, no relation to Damon, a coincidence she acknowledged with a dry-mouth twist when she introduced herself on the first morning, who had spent 30 years examining bloodline records and could read the layered genetic history of a wolf pack the way a geologist reads rock strata, deep time made visible, each layer speaking to conditions that had existed long before anyone currently alive had been born. The examination was not dramatic. It was careful. Agnes asked questions, detailed, specific questions about Sarah's shift history, about the moments in her life when her wolf had been most present and least present, about physical symptoms she had experienced during her years in the coal pack that she had written off at the time as personal weakness. She asked about Sarah's mother. She asked about the journal. She read the journal herself, from cover to cover, and made notes in a system Sarah could not decode. On the 3rd day she took a blood sample and sent it to the King's Records Office in the North Capital. She did this with the efficiency of someone who had already made a provisional conclusion and was gathering confirmation. On the 5th day she said, without preamble, While Sarah was eating breakfast, the coal pack uses a territorial dampening method on its outer borders. It is common. Most packs do not document it. It is designed to calm or mated wolves from outside the pack who might otherwise destabilize the social structure during heat cycles. Sarah put her fork down. It is not designed for long-term exposure, Agnes continued. 17 years of exposure, which is what you would have had if your mother passed through coal territory when she was pregnant with you and the effect was present before your birth, would suppress shift ability in a wolf whose bloodline was already recessive. She made another note. It would look, from the outside, exactly like what Damon Cole told the pack it was. The silence in the room was the specific kind that happens when something you have suspected becomes something you know. He didn't know, Sarah said. Not a defense. A question. I think he did not know, Agnes said carefully. I think he believed what he told the pack. The territory dampening is so standard that most alphas do not consider its effect on specific individuals. He looked at the result, incomplete shift, no bloodline flag, and drew a conclusion that fit the evidence he had. She paused. He was wrong. But wrong with conviction is still wrong. Sarah picked up her fork. She ate the rest of her breakfast in silence, not because she was not thinking but because what she was thinking was too large for immediate words and needed time to find its shape. She had not been broken. She had been dampened. There was a difference. Broken things did not come back. Dampened things, removed from the source of the dampening, reasserted themselves. 4 months in the borderlands. The slow, painful return of her wolf. The full shift, finally, alone behind Owen's stone house. That had not been her healing. That had been her wolf doing what it had been trying to do for 17 years, released at last from a suppression so constant she had never known to question it. She thought about Damon's reasonable voice reading her inadequacies to the pack. She thought about the word worthless and the flat tone in which it had been delivered. She did not cry. She had cried already, in the farmhouse, alone on the 4th night when she had finally understood the full shape of it. She had sat on the floor next to the cold fireplace and cried not for herself but for the girl she had been at 17, walking into a pack with no bloodline and no history and no idea that the ground itself was working against her, and believing, because the evidence was consistent, that the problem was her. That girl deserved to know that the evidence had been wrong. She could not tell her. She could only be what that girl had been trying to become, which was a person who knew what she was worth and said so. On the 6th day Adric Voss came to the eastern wing. He did not send a messenger or a schedule. He simply appeared at the door of her quarters at mid-morning, alone, without guards or advisors, which he suspected was something his guards would have strong opinions about if they knew he was doing it. She opened the door and looked at him. "May I come in?" he said. She considered this. "No one in this pack is going to feed you information I'd rather you not have," she said. "No," he agreed. "But this conversation is not for the pack." She stepped back from the door. He came in and looked at the room with the eyes of someone assessing what a room said about its inhabitant, which in this case was limited because she had unpacked almost nothing. Her bag on the chair. The journal on the table. The mother's dress folded carefully at the bottom of the bag where it would not be disturbed. He sat in the chair across from hers, because there were only 2 chairs and it would have been odd to stand, and she sat in hers, and they looked at each other in the clear morning light. "You knew what you were walking into," he said. "The petition. The summit. You had done the research." "Yes." "Philip," he said. Not a question. She looked at him carefully. "You know Philip." "I know everyone in the borderlands," he said. "That is not surveillance. That is what happens when you have been paying attention to the edges of your territory for 15 years and understand that the edges are where most of the real information is." He laced his hands together. "Philip is a good man and an excellent mediator. I have been trying to find a way to bring him into the king's service for 2 years. He declines every time. He likes being useful on his own terms," Sarah said. "Yes," Adric said. "I understand that impulse." A pause. "Not uncomfortable." The kind of pause between two people who are not yet talking about the thing they are both aware of. Your wolf, he said. When did it come back? 4 months after I left. Slowly. Then all at once. And now? She looked at him steadily. Now it is trying to do something I do not fully have words for yet. I suspect you know what it is. I do, he said. He said it without any overlay of performance or drama, which was its own kind of weight. I recognized the bloodline match the moment you stepped into the hall. My wolf has been loud since then. Mine also, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. This is not nothing, he said. I want to be clear about that. The bond recognition, it is not a social arrangement or a political convenience. It is specific. It does not occur without reason. My wolf has not found this in 41 years. 41 years. He was saying that she was the first. She looked at the cuff of her sleeve. The threads were there. She was not the girl who had stood in this hall 7 months ago believing what she had been told about her own value. I know what I am, she said. I have taken the last 7 months to figure it out, and I have been thorough about it. I am not confused about my worth. She looked up at him. But I am also not going to be chosen by a king without understanding the man. The bond is real. What I do with it is a decision. He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but was the structure a smile is built on. Good, he said. Good. She had not expected that. I do not want a queen who can be swept into things, he said. I have enough people who can be swept. I need someone who decides. He stood. Agnes will have the full documentation ready in 3 days. Damon Cole will have the right of response before a final ruling. I wanted you to know the sequence before it happens. Thank you, she said. Also, he said, at the door, Philip told me you named your carrots. She stared at him. He thought it was worth mentioning, Adric said, and the structure of the smile completed itself briefly, and then he was gone. Sarah sat in the chair for a long moment after the door closed. Then she picked up the journal. She opened it to her mother's page. One line, surrounded by white space, written by a woman who had known something she had not been sure how to explain and had written it down anyway because writing things down was the best tool she had. The king's bloodline recognizes its own. Sarah thought, you knew. She closed the journal. She looked at the grey morning light coming through the eastern window and felt something she did not want to name yet, not because she was afraid of it but because some things deserved to be held without a word on them for a while. Named too early, they became the word. Left unnamed, they stayed fully themselves. She let it stay fully itself. Damon Cole's right of response lasted 40 minutes. He entered the hearing room with his pack lawyer and 2 senior advisors and a folder of documents thick enough that the table shifted slightly when he set it down. He had dressed formally, more formally than the summit, which was a statement about how seriously he was taking this or how seriously he was performing taking it, and Sarah was no longer sure those were different things for him. The hearing was held in a smaller chamber adjacent to Cole Hall. Adric sat at the head of the table. Agnes sat to his right. Sarah sat across from Damon and did not look at him during the preliminary process, not from avoidance but because she was watching Agnes organize documents and Agnes was the person who held the outcome of this in her careful, precise hands. Damon presented his case. He was good at it. She had to give him that. He did not fumble and he did not lose his composure and he made the argument she had anticipated, that the territory dampening was standard practice and could not be attributed to him personally, that Sarah had presented as a wolf with no shift record and that decision had been made in good faith on available evidence, and that retroactive review of a claiming dismissal on grounds of suppression without the pack alpha's knowledge or intent set a precedent that would create uncertainty across every pack in the kingdom. He made the precedent argument twice. He was betting on Adric caring about administrative stability more than individual cases. Agnes had anticipated this too. When Damon finished, she laid out a single sheet of paper in front of Adric and said, quietly, the precedent being set is that suppression-induced dismissal is reviewable. It does not create liability for alphas acting in genuine good faith. It creates accountability for the outcome, which is a different thing. Aldrich read the sheet. Is the bloodline documentation complete? The records office confirmed this morning, Agnes said. Sarah Vane carries a dormant line from the Hollott bloodline, the pre-consolidation royal family, 3 generations back on her mother's side. It was not registered because her grandmother left the record structure before Sarah's mother was born. She paused. It is legitimate. It is documented. And it explains both the bond recognition and the suppression sensitivity. A silence settled over the room. Damon looked at Sarah for the first time since the hearing began. She met his eyes. She did not feel, looking at him, what she had expected, the sharp heat of vindication, the rush of a thin long ode finally arriving. She felt something quieter. A completion. The way a sentence feels when its final word lands. The review finds, Agnes said, reading from a prepared document, that the grounds for dismissal in the claiming ceremony of 7 months prior were based on evidence materially affected by external suppression. The dismissal is ruled procedurally defective under Section 12 of the King's Law. Sarah Vane standing within the Cole Park territory is restored to full status pending the King's formal ruling. Damon's park lawyer said something in a low voice near his ear. Damon shook his head once. Stood. I request a week to present a challenge to the Hollott bloodline documentation. You have 72 hours, Aldrich said. Under Section 12, a challenge to bloodline documentation must be filed within 72 hours of the ruling or the ruling stands. Damon looked at him. Something moved in his expression, not the controlled calculation she was used to, but a crack in it. Actual discomfort. The face of a man who understood that the thing he had thrown away had turned out to be rare, and that this understanding had arrived at exactly the wrong moment to be useful. Understood, he said. He picked up the folder. He did not look at Sarah again as he left. The room reorganized itself in the way rooms do after something that was holding tension releases it. Agnes made notes. One of Aldrich's advisors spoke quietly to a colleague. Sarah looked at her hands in her lap and thought about nothing specific, which was a skill she had developed in the years of standing very still in rooms where things were being said about her and feeling nothing until she was somewhere private. Aldrich said, to the room generally, give us a moment. The room emptied with the smooth, practiced efficiency of people accustomed to being asked to leave. Sarah looked up. He was leaning forward slightly, his hands flat on the table, watching her with the expression she had started to be able to read, the one that meant he was not performing consideration but actually engaged in it. Are you all right? He asked. She thought about the question honestly. I am better than I have been in 7 years, she said. I am also adjusting to several things at once. Yes, he said. As am I. They looked at each other across the table in the hearing chamber of Cole Hall, in the territory where she had been publicly dismissed and had walked away from in her mother's dress with 43 threads and no clear destination. I want to ask you something, she said. He nodded. The bond recognition, she said. I understand what it means biologically. I understand what it means legally under the King's Law. What I want to know is what it means to you, as a person rather than as a king. Because those are different things and I have learned not to assume they line up. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was not empty but was occupied, someone actually considering what they were going to say rather than selecting from a set of prepared responses. When I was 23, he said, I inherited a territory that was in pieces. My father had spent his last decade making decisions from fear rather than from principle, and fear is an excellent short-term motivator and a catastrophic long-term policy. I spent 15 years putting those pieces back together. I learned to care about the work more than the outcome. I learned to trust the process of fair decisions even when the fair decision was hard. He paused. I have not trusted something outside that process in a long time. I did not expect to. His eyes stayed on her. My wolf trusts you. Not as a concept. As you, specific, named, carrying your mother's threads in your cuff and naming your carrots. As a person who walked into my summit knowing the procedure and the risk and having done the work. That is not nothing to me. It is, in fact, a great deal. Sarah felt the unnamed thing in her chest move. She did not try to name it. I am not an easy person, she said. I have been told that multiple times by multiple people, and unlike most things I was told in this building, I believe that one is accurate. Good, he said. Easy people do not survive what you have survived and come out with what you have come out with. She looked at the window. The afternoon light was doing that thing again, the deep color quality of late sun in this part of the territory, the way it turned everything slightly amber. She had watched it from these windows for 7 years and had always thought it was beautiful and had never once said so to anyone. The territory Damon built here, she said. The park under his leadership. There are good people in it. People who made choices I could not have made in their position, but people with reasons. I do not want what happens to them to be punishment for what happened to me. It won't be, Aldrich said. The consolidation agreement holds regardless of what happens with Damon personally. The park's territory is stable. What the park decides to do about its leadership is the park's decision. What if the park decides to keep him? He looked at her carefully. Would that be tolerable for you? She thought about this for a long time. I think what I want, she said slowly, is for him to understand. Not to be destroyed. Not to be made to publicly suffer the way I was made to publicly suffer. To understand that he was wrong, and that the wrongness had consequences, and that the person he dismissed has found other arrangements. She paused. I think the hardest thing for Damon Cole would be irrelevance. And I think that is already in progress. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. You are a complicated person, he said. Not a complaint. An observation that sounded like the thing beneath it was relief. Yes, she said. I told you. He stood. She stood. They were face to face across the table in Cole Hall's hearing room, which was a smaller space than the summit chamber and had light in it from 2 windows and felt, despite its official function, unexpectedly human-scaled. There is a formal process, he said. If the challenge fails in 72 hours, and it will fail, because the documentation is complete, there will be a public declaration before the assembled park. Under the King's law, a bloodline bond must be formally acknowledged in the presence of witnesses. It is ceremonial, but it is also legally significant. Before the park, she said. Before the park. She looked at the window again. The same room. The same park. The same hall where she had stood in her mother's dress and listened to her own dismissal in flat, even sentences delivered from a microphone. Good, she said. He raised his eyebrows slightly. I want them to see it, she said. I want every wolf who stood in that hall 7 months ago and said nothing to be standing in it again. I want them to understand the arithmetic. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then the structure of the smile completed itself fully, briefly, before returning to the careful even expression he wore in official settings. 72 hours, he said. I'll be here, she said. He left. She sat back down. She looked at the empty table and the organized evidence packet Agnes had left behind and the rectangle of amber afternoon light on the floor. She pulled the sleeve of her jacket back far enough to see the cuff. 43 threads. Uneven at the third one because she had been tired. She was still tired. She was tired in a way that was going to take more than rest to resolve, the deep tiredness of someone who has been compensating for a long time and has finally been told they did not need to compensate, which is its own kind of exhaustion because now all the energy spent on the compensating has nowhere to go. She let it sit there. She did not try to resolve it. She had 72 hours. She intended to sleep for a significant portion of them. Damon Cole did not file a challenge. The 72 hours passed. Agnes confirmed on the third morning that no documentation had been submitted. She said it in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for every fact, which Sarah was learning to read as the healer equivalent of keeping your face neutral while the patient processes difficult information. The information was not difficult. It was simply large. Damon had done the arithmetic and decided not to contest it. That was its own statement about what he had understood. The pack was notified of the public declaration the same way packs were always notified of important events, through the head of each household, the information moving outward from the center in the specific organized pattern of a community that had its own internal structure. Sarah knew how it worked. She had been part of that structure for 7 years. She heard, through the general ambient information that moved through Cole Hall, that the pack's response was not what Damon had anticipated. Wolves who had stood in this hall 7 months ago and looked away from her were now, quietly, not looking away from what the King's Law had found. Not dramatically. Not with public declarations of their own guilt. The quiet adjustment of people who understood that they had been part of something they did not want to defend aloud. Clara Mays came to her room on the second evening. Sarah opened the door and looked at her. Clara had the expression of someone who had rehearsed what they intended to say and had now, faced with the actual moment, found the rehearsal insufficient. She was 63. She had known Sarah since Sarah was 17. She had taught her to braid her hair. "I knew," Clara said. "Not about your bloodline. Not specifically. But I knew something was not right. I could feel it. In the way a pack feels things, underneath the official story." She stopped. Tried again. "I did not say anything. And I had reasons. And they were not good enough." Sarah looked at her for a long time. "No," she said. "They were not." Clara nodded. She had expected this. "I do not ask you to forgive me," she said. "I only wanted you to know that I knew it wasn't right, and that I think about it." Sarah thought about this for a moment. She thought about Harriet, walking 11 days through the borderlands with a 4-year-old son. She thought about every wolf who had drifted to the edges of pack territories and then beyond them because the edges had been more honest than the centers. "The next wolf who is dismissed from this pack unfairly," Sarah said, "say something. That is what I want from you. Not an apology to me. Say something, the next time." Clara looked at her. "I will." "Good," Sarah said. "Good night, Clara." She closed the door. She stood in the room for a long moment with her hand on the door and breathed. She was very tired. And underneath the tiredness was something else, something that was working its way toward the surface the way her wolf had worked its way back, slowly and then all at once. She did not try to stop it. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself be tired and angry and relieved all at the same time, without sorting the feelings into the order she preferred. She cried a little. Not much. She had, as she had observed before, spent most of what she had available in that direction. But a little, for the girl who had walked into this hall at 17 with no map and no idea that the ground was working against her. A little for Clara and all the people like Clara who had known and said nothing. A little for the sheer accumulated weight of 7 years of making herself small. Then she washed her face and went to sleep. The declaration was set for the following morning. She wore the dress. Not because anyone expected her to. Not because it was ceremonially required. She wore it because it was her mother's, and her mother had known something she had not been ready to hear for 17 years, and Sarah intended to walk into Cole Hall in it one final time and let the hall know that the story it had believed about the girl in the creamwood dress had been wrong. She checked the cuff. The 43 threads. Uneven at the third one. Still in there. Still counting. She walked to the hall. She walked down the center aisle for the third time, once dismissed, once petitioning, now this. The hall was full in a different way than it had been 7 months ago. Not the held breath full of a verdict being delivered. The uncertain, waiting full of people who understood that something significant was happening and had not yet fully processed what it meant. Aldrich was already at the front of the room. He did not have a microphone. He did not need one. He looked at her when she walked in and something in his expression settled, the way something settles when a thing you have been waiting on finally arrives. She walked to the front of the hall and stood where she had stood before, and did not count the threads this time, and did not count her steps, because she was not afraid and the counting was armor and she did not need armor in this direction anymore. Aldrich said, to the hall, under the King's law, and before the witnesses of this pack and territory, I acknowledge the bond between myself and Sarah Vane, of the Hollowed bloodline, as binding and legitimate. This is not a political arrangement. It is a wolf's bond, witnessed and declared. He extended his hand. Across the hall. In front of everyone. Damon Cole was there. He was standing near the back. She saw him without looking directly at him, the peripheral vision of someone who had spent 7 years tracking where he was in a room. His expression was very still. She looked at Aldrich's hand. She looked at the creamwood dress and the 43 threads. She looked at the faces of 200 wolves who had stood here before and watched her dismissed and were now standing here watching something else entirely. She took his hand. The bond settled into place between them, not like lightning, not like the dramatic descriptions in old stories. Like something fitting into a space that had been shaped for it. Her wolf exhaled, exactly as it had the night she had first fully shifted behind Owen's stone house, the release of something held too long. She laughed. One short, startled, completely unplanned laugh that she could not have stopped if she had tried, because standing in this hall with her hand in the king's hand she had just understood something she had not understood before. Damon Cole's wolf, at this moment, was in submissive posture. Without his permission. Without any of his controlled, careful management of impression and authority. His wolf, watching the bond declared, had simply responded to the truth of it. The man who had called her worthless before his pack was now involuntarily bowing to the mate he had dismissed. She did not say this. She did not need to. Everyone in the room with wolf senses, which was everyone in the room, could feel it. She heard someone near the middle of the hall exhale. She thought it might be Clara Mace. Aldrich looked at her with both eyebrows raised slightly. "Sorry," she said quietly. "I will explain later." "You will explain now," he said, equally quietly. She leaned slightly toward him. His wolf just went submissive. He looked at her. Then he looked at the room. Then he looked back at her with a completed smile, full, brief, real. "The arithmetic," he said. "The arithmetic," she said. She turned, still holding his hand, and faced the hall. All of them. Clara. Edwin. Every face that had looked away 7 months ago. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The moment said it. The dress said it. The 43 threads said it in the language of things that endure. She simply stood there. It was enough. The crown did not fix anything. Sarah had suspected this in advance, which was one of the more useful things about having spent 7 months in the borderlands with very little to do except think. She had understood, somewhere in the long quiet evenings behind Owen's stone house, that survival is not the same as healing, and that victory is not the same as wholeness. She had understood it intellectually. Living it was a different category of understanding. The formal coronation happened 3 weeks after the declaration in Cole Hall. It was held at the King's Seat, 3 days' travel north of Cole territory, in a city whose name Sarah had known all her life the way she knew the names of things that existed in a world that did not include her. Grey stone walls and white streets, and a river running through the middle of it carrying the particular cold clean smell of Highland water. She stood in the ceremonial hall with Aldrich and a regent and the assembled council of the kingdom and said words that bound her to a role, to a territory, to a people, and she meant them, and they changed nothing that was broken. What was broken was not external. It had never been external. The thing that had been done to her in 7 years of making herself small could not be undone by a declaration before 200 wolves or a ceremony before a king's council. It had taken up residence in the places where instinct lives, in the way she automatically reached for an apology before an argument, in the way her body went still when someone raised their voice in a room even if the voice was not aimed at her, in the way she sometimes found herself assessing whether she was being too much, too direct, too certain, in a way that made people uncomfortable. Old habits from old armor. Armor she no longer needed and did not yet know how to take off. Aldrich noticed. He noticed in the way she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him, not by asking, not by pointing, but by simply being present in the vicinity of the thing without requiring her to explain it. The first month of the former bond they had the kind of interaction that she suspected most newly bonded wolves had, the walking out of territory, not the land kind but the personal kind, the gradual mapping of another person's edges and interior. Where they were similar, the patience for process, the preference for specific over general, the belief that most things could be solved by enough information given enough time. Where they were different, he was a man who had governed alone for 15 years and had developed, in that time, habits of decision-making that did not naturally build in the question, "What do you think?" She was a woman who had spent 7 years being told what she thought didn't matter. Neither habit was malicious. Both habits were in the way. The first real argument happened in the 4th week. It was about a decision he had made regarding the Cole pack, specifically, whether to replace Damon Cole as alpha or allow the pack to make that decision internally. He had decided, in consultation with his counsel and without consulting Sarah, to allow the pack to decide. The pack had, predictably, voted to remove Damon. The outcome was the one she had predicted and the one she would have chosen. The process was what she was sitting across from him in his study being specifically clear about. "I had thoughts on this," she said. "You did not ask." He looked at her. "The decision was mine to make. You had been in the pack. I did not want you to feel required to weigh in on something that had personal weight for you." "That is a thoughtful reason," she said. "It is also a decision made for me about what I could handle. Which is something I have a history with." A silence. "That is fair," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I am telling you, not asking you to acknowledge it." Another silence, shorter. "I will ask," he said. "Going forward. Even when I believe I know what you would say." "Good," she said. They sat in the study with the argument completed between them and the outcome adjusted. She picked up the book she had been reading before the conversation began. He went back to the document he had been reviewing. The fire made the small sounds fires make, and outside the window the Highland city was doing its evening things. It was, she thought, absurdly ordinary. She was the queen of a wolf kingdom sitting in a study arguing with her mate about decision-making process, and it was ordinary, which was something she had not imagined being when she was standing on the stone steps of Cole Hall with more to her knee and nowhere to go. Ordinary was a gift she had not known to want. It was also harder than she had expected. She saw Damon Cole twice in the months that followed. The first time was at a territorial council where Damon attended as a private citizen. He had been stripped of the alpha title by his own pack's vote, which had been, as she had predicted to Aldrich, the most difficult outcome for him. Not disgrace. Not public punishment. The quiet rearrangement of the room around his absence. He arrived at the council with the composure of someone who had practiced it, sat through the proceedings, and left without speaking to her. She did not go out of her way to speak to him either. She had said what she needed to say by being there in the form she was in. Words would have been lesser. The second time was 6 months later, at a border mediation where he had been brought in as a local expert on the Eastern Cole Territory geography. She was leading the mediation, which had been a deliberate decision on Aldrich's part that she had been consulted about and had agreed to. Damon walked into the room and looked at her sitting at the head of the mediator's table, and she watched the recognition move through him, not the calculation behind the eyes expression from Cole Hall, but something older and more honest. The face of a person who was genuinely trying to understand what they were looking at and finding that their previous frameworks did not fully apply. She ran the mediation. She was good at it. It turned out that 7 years of reading rooms, of tracking the difference between what people said and what they meant, of learning which silences were safe and which were warnings, had given her a particular set of skills that were extremely useful in a room full of wolves who disagreed about land. When the mediation concluded and the parties were filing out, Damon stopped near her chair. "You were right," he said. He did not say what she was right about. He did not need to. The sentence contained all of it, the 7 years and the ceremony and the word worthless and the reasonable tone and the 200 wolves who said nothing. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. He nodded. He left. She sat at the mediator's table after the room cleared and did something she had not expected to do, which was feel sorry for him. Not a large feeling. Not one that changed anything. But genuine, because she understood now, with more clarity than she had had on the night she walked out of his hall, that he had also been wrong in the direction of himself. He had been so certain of his assessment of her that he had not questioned the evidence on which it was based. And the assessment had shaped 7 years of his life as much as it had shaped hers, the particular closed quality of a person who has decided something and will not revisit it. She gathered her notes and left the room. Aldrich was in the corridor, leaning against the wall with the expression of someone waiting who has decided not to look like they are waiting. "How did it go?" he asked. "The mediation went well," she said. "All parties agreed." "And the other thing?" She considered. "He apologized," she said. "In his way." She tucked the notes under her arm. "I think that is all we are going to get, and I think it is probably enough." Aldrich looked at her carefully. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And she meant it in a specific way, not the reflexive yes that covers difficulty with the shape of ease, but the actual measured assessment of someone checking their internal state honestly. She was all right. Not finished. Not completely healed of the habits the years had built into her. But all right. They walked through the building and out into the city, which was doing its late morning things around them. Street sounds. The smell of bread from a bakery 2 doors down. A dog sleeping in a patch of sun on the opposite pavement, doing the thing dogs do when sun is available, which is to locate it precisely and give themselves to it completely. "I want a garden," she said. Aldrich looked at her. "At the palace," she said. "There are grounds. None of it is garden. I want a section that is specifically a garden that is mine." "Yes," he said without hesitation. He had, by this point, learned that when she made declarative statements about things she wanted, they were not requests for discussion. They were announcements of something she had already decided and was informing him about, which was a conversational style she was still calibrating. She understood that it could be read as not leaving space for him, and she was working on it, but this was a garden and gardens were not the area to work on it in. "I am going to name things in it," she said. "I assumed," he said. "You don't think that's strange?" He looked at her sideways. "I think naming things is how you process ownership of a word that is new to you," he said. Owen said something similar. She stopped walking. "You talked to Owen?" "I went to the borderlands 2 months ago," he said. "I did tell you I was going. You told me you were doing a territorial review of the Greywood borderlands." "Yes," he said. She stared at him. "You went to see Owen?" "I went to thank him," Aldrich said, with complete and uncomplicated honesty, "for taking care of you until you were ready." It seemed important. Sarah stood on the street in the Highland city with the bread smell from the bakery and the dog in the sun and felt the unnamed thing in her chest that she had been carrying since Hall moved all the way to the surface and named itself without her assistance. It named itself the way things name themselves when you have stopped trying to name them and have simply lived with them long enough that they become obvious. She did not say it in the street. She was a complicated person and complicated people did not do everything immediately. But she looked at him and he looked at her and something passed between them that was not the formal language of the bond or the professional language of a king and a queen navigating a shared role, but the simple, specific language of 2 people who had each been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had found, without particularly planning to, that it was lighter when they were near each other. "The garden," she said eventually. "The garden," he agreed. They started walking again. The Highland city opened around them, Greystone and Riverlight and the ordinary sounds of a world continuing to exist, which it did, as it always did, indifferent to the individual stories moving through it. The stories happened anyway. They happened inside the indifference, which was where all the real things happened. She still counted steps. Still counted threads. Still noticed, in a crowded room, the location of every door. These things did not go away. They were part of her now, not the injury but the texture of having survived it. Aldrich knew. He had noticed in the first week and had not asked about it and had not made it into a conversation to be had and had simply, without announcement, started doing a particular thing when they were in crowded rooms. He stood slightly to her right, 1 step behind, in the position that meant he could see the doors she was tracking. Not between her and the door. Not blocking her sight line. just present, in the specific place where present was most useful. He had never mentioned doing it. She had never mentioned noticing. Some things did not need to be named to be understood. She thought about Owen Stonehouse and the notebooks organized by symptom rather than by plant name. She thought about Harriet and her son and the 11-day walk. She thought about Philip and his organized, careful mind and the 3 times he had declined the king's service on his own terms. She thought about Calvin with his cut forearm and his news from the eastern borderlands and the way he had watched her face when he delivered it. She thought about 43 threads and a garden and a crow on a fence post with one bright eye and what it means to be dropped into a world that does not particularly want you and to survive it anyway and to come out the other side still holding the things you started with. The city was cold today in the particular bright cold way of Highland autumn. The kind of cold that was also clarity, the air that thin and clean that it made everything slightly more vivid than usual. She could see a very long way down the street. She kept walking. One foot in front of the other, the way she had always kept walking, from the stone steps of Coal Hall to the Greywood borderlands to the old farmhouse at the edge of coal territory to this city on a bright cold morning, her husband beside her, the 43 threads in her cuff. Still in there. Still counting. The garden took 3 months to establish properly. She had insisted on building it herself, not entirely herself. She was reasonable about the structural work and the soil preparation and the heavy lifting that came with establishing raised beds in ground that had not been worked before, but she had planned it herself and had made the decisions about what went where and why, and she had put her own hands in the dirt for every planting. Aldrich had come out on the second morning to see how it was progressing and had sat on a stone bench at the garden's edge with a report he was supposed to be reading and had not read for most of the hour. Watching her work instead with the expression she had learned meant he was storing information about her for his own internal use, not for any purpose, just because he was a person who paid close attention to things and kept what he found. "You are not going to help," she said without turning around. "You have not asked me to help," he said. "You would like to." "I am at peace with watching." She turned around. He was holding the report but had stopped pretending to read it. She threw a small clump of soil at him. It hit the report. He looked at it. He looked at her. He started laughing, genuinely, the way she had learned to look for, the laugh that did not announce itself but arrived suddenly in the middle of his face and left just as quickly and was, she had concluded, real in a way that very few of his public expressions were. "Sit somewhere useful," she said. He moved the bench closer and held the seed packets when she needed both hands free. And she did not tell him that this was, in its way, exactly the right kind of help, because it would have embarrassed him and she liked him better not embarrassed. The garden grew. She named things. Not all of them. She was not sentimental in the direction of indiscriminate naming. She had standards, but the ones that felt like they deserved a name. The first row of carrot seedlings she named for the 3 borderlands months, which was a private tribute Owen would never know about but which she felt was accurate. The rose she planted along the eastern wall she named after her mother, not the whole bush but the specific plant, because it seemed like the right scale of tribute for a woman who had done one specific enormously important thing and had not survived to explain it. She wrote to Owen twice a month. He wrote back in his angular handwriting on whatever paper was nearest, which was sometimes a scrap of notebook page and once the back of a plant label, and his letters contained the borderlands in compressed form, who had come, who had left, what Harriet's son was doing, the state of the carrot beds, the crow, which was apparently still there and apparently still judgmental. She wrote to Philip once and received no reply, which she had expected. Philip communicated by existing somewhere and being available to people who needed to find him. She thought that was probably fine. The kingdom ran. She was part of the running of it, increasingly, in the specific areas where she had something to contribute, territorial disputes and park mediations and the administrative questions that required someone who had lived at the edges of park structures and understood what official records did not capture about how parks actually worked. She was not decorative and she had made that clear early and Aldrich had made it clear to his counsel in the flat, definitive tone he used for things that were not discussions. There were people in the council who did not know what to do with her. She had learned to find this mildly amusing rather than threatening, which was a significant development. Agnes remained in the king's service and became, over the months, something Sarah could not quite categorize, not a friend exactly, because Agnes did not function in the register of friendship, but a person whose professional opinion Sarah valued and who had developed, reciprocally, what appeared to be genuine respect for Sarah's mind. They had arguments about territorial law and bloodline record-keeping and the right way to structure formal petitions that were extremely enjoyable to both of them, which was the basis of a functional relationship if not a warm one. The Cole Pack sent a delegation 8 months after the declaration. Not Damon. He had moved to the outer edge of Cole territory and was, by all reports, doing something involving the lumber trade, which was useful and practical and had nothing to do with pack politics. The delegation was led by a young woman named Beth who had been voted in as interim alpha by a pack majority and who was sharp and careful and had the specific quality of someone who had watched how the previous structure had failed and had made specific notes. Sarah received the delegation. Aldrich was present but let her run it, which was now the default rather than the exception. Beth sat across the table from her in the meeting room that looked out over the garden and said what she had come to say, which was that the Cole Pack was requesting formal inclusion in the King's protections and was prepared to submit to the King's law in full, including its provisions on dismissal review and bloodline documentation. She said it with the slightly formal precision of someone who had practiced the words but meant them. Sarah asked 3 questions. She asked what the Pack's plan was for the territorial dampening, whether it would be discontinued or maintained at reduced levels. She asked how the Pack intended to handle the historical records of previous dismissals during the Damon Cole period. She asked, last, whether Beth had the full support of the Pack Council or whether this was a majority position with dissent. Beth answered all 3 honestly, including the third, that there was a minority who were uncomfortable with how quickly the shift had happened but that the minority was not large enough to block the decision and was shrinking as the practical benefits of the King's protections became clearer. Good, Sarah said. Honest assessment of internal dissent is more useful than the pretense of unanimity. Write it into the formal submission. Beth looked at her with a slightly surprised expression. Most negotiators prefer the unified front presentation. Most negotiators, Sarah said, do not need to implement the agreement afterward. The people implementing it need to know where the resistance is. Beth made a note. Then she looked up and said, not in the formal voice but in the personal one, you were part of this pack for 7 years. I was born into it. I need you to know that what happened to you was not representative of what the pack wanted to be. It was what the pack allowed. Those are different things, but the difference doesn't make the allowing acceptable. Sarah looked at her. I know, she said. Build something better. That is what I intend to do, Beth said. Sarah thought that this was probably true, and that the pack had, in finding Beth rather than someone who looked like Damon, made the right turn, and that this was the thing about packs and about communities generally that she had always believed when she was inside them and had doubted when she was outside them, that they were capable of correction. Slow, painful, incomplete correction. But correction. After the delegation left, she went to the garden. She sat in the dirt between the carrot rows, which were doing well, and looked at the eastern wall where the rose had taken hold and was beginning to show the first signs of the root establishment that would let it climb. She was not the girl who had walked into Cole Hall at 17. She was not the woman who had stood in it at 24 in her mother's dress being told what she was worth. She was not the person who had walked into the Greywood borderlands with nothing but the dress and 43 threads and 2 good legs. She was those people, all of them, in the way that you are every version of yourself you have ever been. They did not go away. The girl at 17 was still in there, still doing what she had always done, which was pay attention and survive. The woman at 24 was in there too, still standing very still in rooms where things were being said about her, still counting threads. But she was also this. Whatever this was. The person sitting in the garden dirt of a highland city, queen of a wolf kingdom, named not worthless but something else by someone who had chosen to look carefully before deciding. She pulled a weed from between 2 carrot seedlings. She did not name the weed. She had standards. The rose on the eastern wall caught a bit of the afternoon light and did the thing roses do when they catch light, turn it into something that lasted longer than the light itself. She watched it for a while. Then she stood up, brushed the dirt off her knees, and went back inside to the work that was waiting. There was always work waiting. That was the thing about building something from pieces that had been broken and edges that had never quite fit and people who had walked very long distances to get somewhere better. It did not finish. It did not arrive at a place where you could set it down and say, done. You showed up the next morning and you did it again. She had been doing that all her life. She was good at it. She intended to keep being good at it.